This is our first chance to say hello to you. We've got 3 webinars coming up in the next 3 weeks, and so we're just delighted that you've joined us. This is Growth During Crisis, a thoughtful process for managing your business through chaos, sponsored by Perkins & Company, Key Process Innovations, and True North Partners. When you hear that first statement of growth through crisis, you may think this is a sales webinar. It is not. It is a webinar that is really making the most of the COVID crisis and re-emerging stronger and better than ever after the fact. Just as in spring's here, the rain and the sun seem to show up at the same time, and growth happens during spring, and it requires various elements. You have the rain that comes down, you have, and all those things create this environment that the little seedlings come through the soil and sprout. We're looking for those little seedlings, those little ingredients that actually cause us to be able to go from dormancy to vibrancy during this time of crisis, and looking at the key steps that are necessary to make that possible. The presenters that we have for the next 3 weeks are Don Beelan, principal at Perkins & Company. Don's company specializes in ownership transitions, business succession, advanced corporate and personal planning, specifically for successful owners and individuals. The second webinar will be presented by Julie Marquis, Managing Director of Key Process Innovations, and her firm is dedicated to enhancing company profitability by focusing on leadership and sales and innovation. And then I will be presenting the third one in June 3rd. My name is Scott Phillips, Managing Partner of True North Partners. And our business is about transformation specifically with businesses. We specialize in family business transitions, strategic management, business optimization and coaching, succession planning, and leadership development. A couple of weeks ago, the 3 of us got together and said, well, why are we doing a webinar? Or why would we want to do a webinar? And we really came back with this sort of idea that we have several things that we can provide for people, specifically to make this meaningful. The first is to improve chances of leading your company out of the crisis in a stronger way. It was difficult to get into it. We have some thoughts on how to actually get out of it and move forward in a much stronger way. Secondly, to deal with some of the strategic questions that have surfaced through this process, and to work on helping identify and move things forward in a way that is very strategic. Third, to minimize risk and leverage possible opportunities. You're going to hear quite a bit in the second webinar on the leveraging the possible opportunities and minimizing the risk. And then lastly, to help you spring forward through the chaos and move things forward in a real positive and good way. Just to look really quickly at the next couple of weeks, again, today will be Don Beelan, specifically looking at the planning and preparing and the response. The second webinar, Julie Marquis, leveraging new opportunities. And then thirdly, I will be presenting the replanning process, if you will, of going back and looking at specifically how to actually prepare for the next chapter in this crisis period. We want to make sure that we have time for questions and answers. And so what we would like you to do is to take down your questions. You can actually push on the question and answer button. If you look on your bottom of your screen, probably, it says Q&A. You can click on that and type in your question. And Julie will be collecting those. We will actually be answering those questions at the end of the program today. So be sure and add those and put them in, and we will try to answer as many as we can possibly answer. At this point, I'd like to pass this over to Don Beelan, and he will present this front-end piece to you. Don?
Very good. Thank you, Scott, for the overview and the lead-in. It is truly my pleasure to share my thoughts today about how one may best position a business to emerge from this crisis stronger and really position an organization to thrive post-crisis. So the process slide that we see here, just a couple opening comments, is considering the challenging and dynamic nature of today's business environment. I believe it's very important to take stock in your current position, visualize what your new normal may be, and then also develop several what-if scenarios. So this process will serve as the foundation to plan and manage your journey going forward. So the process diagram lines out a methodical step-by-step process to plan and prepare, to respond, leverage new opportunities, and replan your strategy to adapt to your evolving business environment. So to increase the probability of success, it will take a well-defined, well-orchestrated strategy with all the key stakeholders to position the employees and the business to emerge and thrive. So in today's session, I will focus on the plan and prepare segment on the left-hand side of the process and focus on that phase and really focus on the key financial and communication considerations related to this phase. So this session will touch on the process steps. So I'll talk about assessing the situation, defining desired outcomes, strategically positioning the business, implementing decisions, monitoring results, and then adjusting accordingly. The subsequent two sessions, as Scott had referenced, will cover the respond, the leverage and replan, and re-prepare phases of this process. So underlying this process on the bottom of our diagram are three fundamental practices and critical elements that should accompany and support your planning. They are communication, tracking and measuring, and managing cash flow. These elements, these elements need to be what I would say omnipresent during each stage of the reemergence process and will be embedded and intertwined in our three sessions. Next slide, please. So let's talk about how to respond and strategically position the business for recovery. First off, one key is to not delay on key decisions. Delays can be worse than making a suboptimal decision. So unfortunately, this crisis has affected all businesses. It's a matter of varying degrees of the impact on the business model. So some companies' business model may have fundamentally changed, and hopefully the business owner has realized and acknowledged this. The natural tendency for leaders while in a crisis is to focus primarily on driving revenues and reducing expenses, believing that is the best way to preserve capital. So conceptually, yes, this makes perfect sense, considering that cash is king and liquidity is critical. However, it's important not to confuse revenues with cash flow. Both are used to indicate the health of a company. Revenues measure the effectiveness of the sales and marketing department, whereas cash flow is liquidity and the ability to fund short-term obligations. So cash flow is beyond sales and revenues, but reflects the company's ability to generate cash in a variety of ways. So such as, by example, accessing financing. That may include lines of credit, may include term debt, reducing assets, deferring liabilities, or even additional capital contributions to the business. So taking potentially many forms and many approaches towards providing the liquidity and the cash flow necessary to fund operations. So the first dot point is by creating a 6 to 12 month projection, you can quantify the results of changing these variables that I mentioned based on your vision of the company's new normal. So second, we believe that the first step is to start with a top-down approach and really review the big picture drivers. So what do I mean by that? Well, review such things as what's happening in your market. So the market dynamics, whether or not they be positive or negative. What's happening with competition? What are your competitors doing to position themselves? What's happening with the supply of your products in the marketplace? Or even product, what I would call elasticity. You know, the difference between by changing price, what that does to impact sales volumes. So by taking this approach, you have to look at the other key components of the revenue drivers and the cost drivers. So what do I mean by revenue drivers? Well, revenue drivers are going to consist of things such as product pricing, sales mix, customer demand, trends, and other trends to give you an idea of what's happening in your marketplace. So start big picture. It's easy to get very granular and look at the source of all of your various revenues and looking at the very expenses without necessarily looking at what's ultimately happening in your marketplace. Secondly, it's important to evaluate the cost drivers. So what's happening with the elements that drive your cost of goods sold? What's happening with your supply chain? What's happening with your raw materials, their availability, their pricing? And then, of course, what's the status of your workforce? How has your team been impacted? What are their capabilities? What's their access? And are the key players still there? So this process, of course, needs to be very customized to reflect your company type. So by example, what you might do for a manufacturing company may be very different than what you do for a service company, maybe a retail company, or even a property management company. So from this process, it will be important to identify and note what is working and what is not working. So it's easy to go through this process and not step back, like I said, take stock in the situation. And then as you step your way through this process, is to say what elements of my process or the changes that I'm making are going to be effective, and then which items are going to be ineffective that need to be eliminated. So on the next stop point, we talk about scenario planning. Well, according to McKinsey Quarterly, scenarios, quote, help you ask the right questions and prepare for the unexpected, unquote. So the first step, we believe, is to create detailed cash flow projections. So you start by building what is oftentimes termed as the base case, which will be a function of historical results, but more importantly, your vision of a likely scenario going forward. Next, you'll want to create 2 or 3 alternate scenarios. So by example, you might model a fast recovery scenario and then maybe a slow recovery scenario. So under each scenario, it's important to evaluate the inflows and outflows, what's happening with working capital, and identify any anticipated shortfalls relative to your resources. And finally is evaluate how best to scale the business under each scenario. So there's going to be a lot of variables that are going to go into this process, but what you're going to be able to do is identify the relative difference in the impact on your business by changing these variables on a longer term basis. So initially, we're suggesting that we do at least a monthly, in some cases, we're even suggesting a weekly cash flow analysis, because that way you're able to quantify and identify those key drivers, and then run that out for an extended period of time, sometimes 6, 12, even 18 months. And then you can see the long-term impacts by changing these variables under the different scenarios. So in summary, scenario analysis will enable you to visualize the impact of certain assumptions, develop a strategy, quickly adapt, and be better prepared. So the next stop point we want to talk about is strategies to maintain margins. So I'm going to get into some specifics here, and feel free to note these, and if we want to talk about them further in the question and answer period, we will. But I want to give you some content that will really give you an idea of some of the things that businesses commonly do. But a key message I believe that it's important to convey is, number one, is stop focusing on profitability and focusing on liquidity management. Review the areas that to reduce both fixed and variable expenses. So generally, owners do know best. They know their business. Many times they've built it from ground up, so they understand the key variables. But when you break down, look at your fixed expenses and figure out how you scale them, and look at your variable expenses, then you have an idea of what are the results of changing those. So let me give you a couple examples. So in some cases, what you might even include is negotiating, maybe, for example, a temporary lease reduction. You could defer maintenance. You could look at restructuring employee compensation. You might implement a hiring freeze. Looking at delaying promotions, you might modify benefit packages, and of course, focus on increasing efficiencies and productivity through better processes, in which we'll talk about subsequently in the other 2 sessions forthcoming. Other cash flow strategies may include modifying payment terms. So let's say, for example, you might have your customers pay you in 30 days, promote it maybe with discounts, and then you might continue to maybe stretch your vendors and try to get even maybe like a net 60 type arrangement. You might even consider something innovative like requiring deposits on large orders. You might be innovative and create the ability to have your customers use mobile payments. You also then will look at your inventory, reduce slow moving or obsolete inventory. You could delay equipment purchases, but you also could restructure capacity based on your anticipated demands. So you'll have to scale the business accordingly. So those are some of the things you might consider when you look at your fixed, your variable expenses, but also major cash use sources. With the cash flow models, I think it's very important not to overlook your one-time expenses. So example, you might have scheduled equipment purchases, you might have employee training programs, you might have bonus payments, you might have equipment or facility repairs. So when you do the modeling, it's easy to look at the things that you will experience on a daily or weekly basis, but not overlook those scheduled larger ticket purchases that might occur at a later time. Also, look internally at some of the infrastructure items, for example, your insurance coverages or even contract provisions. So you could review insurance coverage for any sort of, like, let's say, disaster payments related to business interruption. You could also consider and work with legal counsel to evaluate ability to modify contracts. You've probably heard of the term force majeure. Much has been written over the past few weeks about force majeure clauses in the impact of the novel coronavirus on contract performance obligations. So within a disaster, which the COVID-19 has been identified as a disaster, you could potentially modify your contracts based on this force majeure type provisions. So in summary, most organizations don't have the financial strength to survive even a short-term cash flow crisis. So having accurate forecast on hand is essential. And when you have these working reports, you and your management team can monitor your company's results and make adjustments to plan as needed. Next. Of course, with any sort of plan, you want to track your communications. So I've actually, let me jump one more slide, Scott. So to pull this together is looking at your communication process. So one of the best ways to avoid a liquidity crisis within a company is to train and develop your top managers' understanding of the importance of forecasting. So you have to look at the mechanics of the process, the benefits of scenario planning, and get their buy-in in that overall process. As with just about any other successful process within a company, communications is one of the keys to accurate cash flow forecasting. An effective forecast requires input from a variety of individuals throughout your organization who can provide important figures and valuable insights that will increase their understanding of the key cash flow drivers. So finally, once you've completed your financial forecast, you'll need to make key strategic decisions about how you will run your company and manage cash flow. It's equally important to monitor the actual results relative to the projections to understand the differences and make appropriate adjustments. So doing this will allow you to identify opportunities and improve your process and take advantage of better cash flow positions. So those are the key things that I want to touch on in my section is what can you do to respond? What can you do to prepare? What are the process elements that you could potentially consider to manage cash flow, preserve liquidity, access other capital resources, and then involve your team through that process so you can then have a very united, cohesive, coordinated approach towards managing your cash flow, your liquidity, and positioning your business to thrive and emerge from this crisis stronger and thrive in the new economy. Next. So let's open it up for questions and just walk through it. I did provide a fair amount of content, a few specifics, but would like to hear and understand what you guys are thinking.
Don, we don't have any questions that have come in yet, but you talked about doing some scenarios. Have you looked at any stress tests? Is that something that you would recommend as well? Would be to run some stress tests on the business and kind of see where those areas of concern would be?
Yeah, that's a great question. Considering that scenarios are almost a basis of probability, so you create your scenarios, and what's important is that when you create your scenarios that you weight them equally. And the reason why I say that is because we have a natural tendency to gravitate towards one scenario that we have a stronger bias or preference to. So once you create your scenarios, the ability to stress test them is by changing some of the key drivers, whether or not be cost drivers or revenue drivers, and see what the relative results are going to be. What you can do, our modeling doesn't currently do that, but some modeling is able to run more of a Monte Carlo simulation and run through a what-if scenario that will change some of the key variables and understand the probability of those key variables occurring. So what you can do based on a business historical results is look at the probability of certain of the assumptions coming true and which ones you think are less likely. And then that's where you can stress test it by putting more weight on the likely outcomes and then underweighting the unlikely or unpredictables. So stress testing, I think, is very important to model the what ifs and the outcomes.
Okay, let me ask, Scott, I'm going to ask you kind of a follow-up to that is, so once you've kind of done the stress test, what would be some suggestions on some steps that some owners, business owners, management could take in order to kind of address some of those weaknesses? I don't put you on the spot a little bit, but.
Well, I think that, you know, again, the stress test provides you with some understanding around what's going to work and what's not going to work potentially. But I think the flexibility piece is always the part that you've got to kind of keep in mind. I think, again, recognizing, as Don identified, the cash flow being the paramount piece of this puzzle, I think that, again, as you step into it, I think you can jump in full bore into the pool, or you can dip your toe in. I think the question is, can you get a good read on what's going to happen if you do either? And I think it's important to kind of have a sense of whether you should dip your toe in or you should jump all the way into the puddle, into the pool. The other thing that comes to mind too is that you know, during crisis, sometimes it's the best time to actually invest in making changes that you knew needed to be made all the way along. And so, at some level, have excess cash, and it's difficult in this time to have much excess cash. I think for most anybody, unless your business is immune to it in some fashion, that there may be some opportunities to actually restructure some pieces in this time to actually get you prepared for a recurrent resurgence in the new marketplace. So kind of even thinking forward a little bit of how can I actually change maybe a little bit of focus, a little bit of infrastructure, a little bit of the efficiencies to improve what I have. Maybe a good time to look at those aspects as well.
Absolutely. I think we're actually going to be talking about that. We will be talking about that next week during the webinar. So we had a couple of questions coming in. One was, for those who have received PPP, what role does cash flow factor into managing finances?
Great question. Maybe I'll throw in a couple thoughts. As we all know, with PPP, 75% of the proceeds, as far as forgiveness are concerned, need to be allocated towards primarily payroll, and then 25% sort more towards rent and interest expense, et cetera. But I think what you want to do, and of course, there's a lot of fluidity right now with PPP with the 8-week period in which you need to use those proceeds. And in fact, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin talked about how they're going to be modifying that potentially, and to get additional guidance on the 8-week period to use it before June 30th. So there's a lot of things going on there, but what we do anticipate is that 8-week period could be modified. But what you'd want to do is making sure that you track specifically the use of those PPP funds, document the use of those funds. Most individuals, I think, have been counseled by their banking, like the SBA banker, to create separate accounts so those funds are positioned, and then as they're paid out for those permittable expenses, then you can track and document how those are used. And that's going to be especially critical for the forgiveness calculation. And fortunately, just as of a couple of days ago, even the AICPA has issued a forgiveness calculator, and other organizations have. So it's important when you look at that forgiveness calculator that you properly document, but also then coordinate that with your cash flow, and you not intermix what you realize with your PPP funds that doesn't go into your kind of normal operating kind of process is create some distinctions before those allocable type expenses and what those are for forgiveness purposes versus what you would do, how you'd allocate funds to use those to run and operate your business on a normal basis. So it's a little bit, it's very important as we look at the use of the PPP funds that they be allocated appropriately, and then you do somewhat almost partition off the other funds that would use to manage your cash flows.
So would you advise your whoever's listening to talk to Perkins, to the banker? I mean, who do you think is ultimately going to be able to provide the best advice?
Great point. Two things. Number one is the final determinant of loan forgiveness is going to be on the bank and the lender. So they will have the final say. Some banks are issuing forgiveness calculators. However, Perkins or your most likely your existing accountant would have the ability through their process to help with that forgiveness calculator. And because there's a lot of nuances in terms of full-time equivalents, terms of timing, whether or not what kind of interest expense that you can allocate, rent and leases and third-party relationships and you name it. So I would encourage you to coordinate with your accountant initially to review and making sure that you're going through the process properly, get you set up properly, but then also work with your banker to see if they have a forgiveness calculator that they're going to be using. I've reached out to a couple lending institutions to see if they actually have a tool, and the ones I've reached out to do not currently. So they're making this up as you go because the regulations are somewhat in flux. So I think it's a combination of your accountant and it's a combination ultimately of your banker.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We've got another question. It's addressed to you. Don, whatever new normal is or becomes, will the way we operate our business change forever?
It's going to be very, I wish I had that crystal ball. I think it's going to be very business specific. Certain businesses, I believe, for example, real estate, looking at one of my clients is a large real estate property manager, real estate leasing company. I think their business in essence has changed fundamentally, permanently, based on occupancy. But then looking at maybe other businesses, one may be a transportation business, where their business has done very well through this period, and they are going to maybe have to modify or tweak elements of their business, such as maybe their workforce or off-site working or remote working or hoteling, what they might do with their workforce and how they use technology to run and operate their businesses. So I think it's important for a business to be involved in trade associations or sometimes mentoring groups, which are called 20 groups. And for example, you see what's with the OADA, with the Oregon Automobile Dealer Association. They've managed this process extremely well, and then they work as a collaborative group of business owners across the state to talk about best practices, talk about changes in industry, talking about sales practices, talk about sales, delivery of their products, talk about their workforce, their training, prevention mechanisms, you name it. So I wish I had a better answer to that, but I think it's going to be very specific and reach out to your peer group, to your industry.
If I could add on to that, Don, a little bit, I think the silver lining in this cloud essentially is that virtually every company that has kind of addressed and looked at the crisis that is the pandemic have started new planning in new ways. And I think one of the beauties with the clients that we've worked with is that almost to a company, they've actually stopped and spent time thinking about the things that they should have been thinking about anyway. And so at some level, I hope that the new normal is that actually there's much more thought given to what if, what happens if, how do I handle this, what do I do with that? And we're going to talk about that in the next couple webinars, though, specifically about how do you actually think forward, anticipating where you're going and what you may have to address, but what may you not even see today that you're going to actually have to pay attention to in the future. So I think the new normal actually can be a really good new normal, which is much more thoughtful, much more anticipatory in terms of what's happening, instead of just defaulting on everything's great, let's just keep going the way we're doing it. And so I think that whole idea of thinking forward and anticipating changes is a good new normal for us.
Absolutely. Maybe Scott, just want to, if I could add on to that just a little bit. As I emphasized in some of my early remarks, is that I think it's important to first start with this top-down approach and review the big picture drivers. It's easy for an organization to get mired in the details and try to figure out how we can save on such things as minute as, office supplies, or what we're going to be doing to modify our rent arrangement, or what we might do to cut and reduce utilities. Those oftentimes, sure, they're very important, but I think it's very important for an organization to look a little bit more globally. Look what's happening around them with their competition, with the marketplace, with distribution channels, like I mentioned, supply channels, what's happening with your customers, how have their buying patterns changed? What's happening with your competition? How are they evolving? Is your organization evolving to the extent that they are? Are you remaining relevant? So those kind of things, I think it's harder for an organization to do. But I think that's one reason why it's important to reach out to other resources that might have a multidimensional perspective on what's happening with that particular industry. So you can look at it from a strategic standpoint and position the business in terms of, finance, of course, is one of it, but also how you deliver, how you manufacture, and how you service your customers' needs. That, I think, fundamentally will change, because I think our consumer demand patterns have been impacted by this crisis.
I think that's a really good point. I will just add a little bit onto that from a slightly different perspective, and that would be that as you start to look at the new normal, think about what those areas in the last few months that have really caused you a lot of anxiety over your business, and start to address those things, so that if this were to happen again, I'm going to make sure I have enough cash to last a little bit longer, whatever those factors are, but really be cognizant of where's that anxiety coming from and what steps do you need to make, so that as you move forward, you're not going to have to struggle through those. You might have struggled through something else, but at least you'll be able to have taken some solid action in order to address those issues.
Yeah, Julie, just to piggyback on that just a little bit, if I could. That's where I did get into this into my remarks today, but I think it's important, and I shared that in a different webinar, is contingency planning. So what I mean by that is what should the business do if certain situations or factors or environments present themselves, is making sure that the business is thinking through, what do we do if this were to occur? How do we react? What does the business model look like? What's it look like from a revenue standpoint, an expense standpoint, and a free cash flow standpoint? But then also is positioning, creating that contingency plan so you can react quickly and be positioned, but also making sure that the business doesn't do the proverbial head in the sand approach and cut expenses, cut the overall infrastructure, cut capacity. So when the economy does return and we do reemerge into more of a new normal, that the business still has the capacity and the ability to be competitive and even take on a little bit more risk by even new product offerings or new market spaces, or even new service offerings. So it's important that businesses maintain the capacity of their infrastructure because when this economy does emerge, we have to make sure that they are able to deliver on what your customers are demanding.
Great. I'm going to move on to another question that just came in, and this was actually a good question, which is, I normally run my business debt-free, but there's a lot of uncertainty right now. And this business owner was just alerted that he or she can apply for their EIDL for an amount of anywhere from $1,000 to $65,000. And he doesn't want to overborrow, but also don't want to end up short if this thing keeps going. So how do you recommend kind of deciding how much of a loan you should take out in order to make sure that you're not over leveraging yourself or your business?
I think the simple answer is back to your scenario planning is based on your risk aversion or ability to take on risk, is go through your scenarios, run through the business projection under what you think is a likely scenario. Then you layer on certain levels of debt to see at what point it becomes problematic if the business underperforms. So even you create your base case scenario, layer on the debt scenario of what you think you would want to borrow based on what you need for operating capital, maybe even some operating reserves. And then you run your slow recovery scenario and see where the breaking points are in that arrangement where you would become problematic. Because your lender most likely will run similar scenarios or want to run some projections to see the company's ability to finance that debt and repay that debt, cash flow that debt. So that scenario planning will give you a much better sense of the likelihood that you'll be able to repay that based on performance. So I think you just have to kind of run the numbers and play with the what ifs.
I think the other part of that equation, though, is how do you actually manage it? And so setting up a separate account for this particular funding piece would be an appropriate step as well. And actually, the repayment terms may be in effect as well. I would probably tend to say you're probably better to have too much debt that can be repaid potentially than to have not enough debt that allows you to or causes you to go out of business because you didn't take enough. I would rather err on the side of having to pay back too much than err on the side of not having enough to do what I need to do. But manage it as a separate account and use it as a separate fund as well that allows the integrity of the balance to be paid back if that's possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of businesses are finding that if they have capacity for additional debt through their strength of their balance sheet or strength of their cash flows, is that it's recommended in many cases that the business owner go ahead and tap into those facilities and take advantage of them while they're available. The banks are being inclined to push out a lot of additional debt. There's a tremendous amount of new money that's being generated by the Fed and the repurchase, the repo type programs that are occurring. So there's a tremendous amount of liquidity that is put inside banks, and the banks need to put this to work. The PPP programs themselves to banks are not profitable. It's actually, talking to several bankers, it's probably going to be more of a net loss because the cost of administering and those loans and overseeing this program is going to far exceed what they're paid by the federal government for these programs. So the banks are looking for other sources of profitability. So if a company has a strong balance sheet, I would encourage them to take advantage of the generous lending environment that we find ourselves. And if you don't need that money, you can always repay it, like Scott had referenced, but at least you have that ability to access that capital. The other component that I'm seeing with some businesses is somewhat predatory, but they're trying to build their access to liquidity and their cash reserves. So in the event that there are opportunities in the marketplace, they're geared and positioned to take advantage of those opportunities. It could be even take the form of acquisitions. It could take the form of purchasing elements of companies that are struggling. There will be a number of companies that are going to go through bankruptcy. And they're going to be in a position that they need to raise money and raise money quickly just to keep their business and go through a reorganization. So there is, I think, a proactive measure that can be taken by certain businesses to position themselves to take advantage of the opportunities that are presented in the marketplace because of this crisis.
Well, that segues into another question which just came in, which is this a good time to sell or to try and lead M&A efforts towards for weaker companies? I think you hit half of that question, but what about, is this a good time to try to sell your company?
Yeah, I think it's going to be conditional. Number one, if your business has rallied through this environment and has actually maintained or even excelled. By example, I've seen some retailers in certain segments do extremely well through this environment. So those businesses, if the reason for selling was to have a liquidity event to reduce their overall risk profile and maybe take some chips off the table to go and do something else because what they've endured may have been very problematic and very stressful, very even emotionally demanding. So in that particular case, I think you have to look at the reason for selling. And if the reason is to address either business concerns or personal concerns, then a person may consider it. There will be, I think, some excess demand coming into the marketplace for businesses because there's still a tremendous amount of liquidity on the sidelines that are seeking a home. Private equity, family offices, larger public companies that are looking for growth, because we're going to have supposedly relatively, maybe it's even said a swoosh type economic recovery. It's not going to be a V shape. Most economists are saying it's a U shape or a swoosh shape. So meaning that it could be slow. So companies that are looking and starving for growth and profitability will be out looking for additional acquisitions. So depending on your industry, it may be a very good time. But if your business has struggled through this environment and you've seen significant impacts to your EBITDA or EBITDA, where your free cash flow or your cash flow going forward has been severely impacted, then you will pay the price. Discount rates have not come down dramatically. So we're not seeing that businesses at this point their valuations are going to be dramatically impacted when you look at the calculation of a discounted cash flow type analysis. But if a business has struggled and have been impacted, you probably want to go through a recovery period first, stabilize the business, work on shoring up the balance sheet, making sure you have stability within your workforce, making sure you've done your infrastructure reviews, making sure that you have maybe even reviewed statements, et cetera. So all the steps you would necessarily have to take to position the business for sale. So it's going to be very business specific based on the condition of the business and based on what's happened to the business.
I think, Don, that that's good advice specifically for companies that are struggling through this period. I don't know what the numbers are. I'm guessing it's 80-20, 80% struggle and 20% have done really well as a result of scenarios. But that 20% has just the opposite opportunity, I think, in terms of saying, is there a way that I can do vertical integration or add services or change what I'm doing, add locations, geographies, things like that. So I think there are opportunities for acquisitions specifically for companies that are cash heavy or have had some positive impacts of the crisis. So I think at some level, if you're in one of those boats, we have probably 20% of our clients currently that we're working with that are actually finding some real advantages in this crisis period. And they, in fact, may have some opportunities to pick up some other difficult scenarios that can be picked up. I would say this, that there are some people that actually would benefit by selling in this period because they have not the appetite nor the capability of surviving. And so it may be actually better to think about, selling at this point. It would be probably at a discounted sort of number, I'm guessing. But and then there are those that would benefit by some acquisition. So I think it's a good time to at least consider that and think through, where do you stand with this? I think that still the free cash flow and the cash flow analysis has got to play into it, even if you have had a positive sort of period of growth. So that's the counter look at it, if you will.
Yeah, I just maybe throw one other piece into that equation is, I think one mistake that business owners make is they're focused on maximizing value from the transaction. I think that's their primary objective. Well, oftentimes that's important. However, it's important to look at it relative to the individual's personal financial requirements, what their individual goals and objectives are. So if the business is still going to garner a value that is going to satisfy the individual's personal financial requirements, and it's in line with what they want for their employees, for their family, for their community, then I think those factors are going to weigh into that decision, because it's important not to look at this, I think, very, singularity, but more multidimensional from the standpoint of how does this fit in terms of what I'm ultimately trying to accomplish with this business, and what my long-term vision and personal goals are.
That's a good point. Actually, I wrote down that you talked about the importance of focusing on liquidity, not necessarily profitability. And I think that's really kind of, you're restating that again, is a really important point.
Yeah, absolutely. And see, and remember, when you look at how you value a business, in most cases, of course, there's three primary ways, but one of them is going to be more of a cash flow basis. So when an investor, especially a private equity type investor, or I even mentioned family office investor, or if it's going to be a strategic purchaser, what they're going to be looking at is free cash flows, ability to finance and pay for what they just purchased. But more so, what's that look like on what you call an accretive basis? So how much incremental value is added to the acquirer's balance sheet in terms of the overall business value in aggregate? So when you look at a business's cash flow, if they're managing towards cash flow, maintaining cash flow and liquidity, they shouldn't go to market if they're in a liquidity crunch and they're distressed, or they have excess debt on the balance sheet, or they're not able to meet their short-term obligations. That is going to be very problematic from a purchaser standpoint, because it's going to be very undesirable, and it's not going to be accretive from a cash flow standpoint. So it's very important that if a business is preparing for an exit, that they do what they can to shore up their cash flow. And that's one reason you go through this scenario analysis, is to figure out how do you modify your fixed and variable expense kind of arrangement or mix to maximize and maintain cash flow and maintaining working capital and operating cash.
Excellent.
So if I could throw in a question, maybe for Julie to answer, how do you balance investing in growth versus maximizing your cash flow? In other words, when there are opportunities to look forward and say, is there a way to expand my sales operation and do some of the additional work that gets me back on track from a revenue standpoint, versus making that investment versus hanging on to that cash and managing your liquidity?
I think that I think you always have an opportunity to be a little more creative, especially in a time like this, in order to be able to hit some of your goals. So I would say, yeah, if you have plenty of cash, you can put a lot of money towards your marketing efforts or sales efforts. But in this time, we're going to conserve that a little bit, and we're going to do it a little bit differently. So be open to not having the full scale kind of sales process, if that's what you're talking about, optimizing, and look at different tools, lower cost tools, in order for you able to do that. And I also say that's true even within your processes, because you don't have to do a complete overhaul in order to be able to improve your productivity, increase your efficiencies. It doesn't require brand new equipment and all of this huge investment from a capital standpoint. There are things you can do internally and really leverage what your strengths are within your organization. So don't get caught up in, oh my gosh, I don't have enough money to do this. Think about, I need to do this. How can we do this in a way that the business can support it?
Yep. And additionally, one thing that I'm seeing is becoming a trend in the marketplace is a lot of like angel funds are emerging, where angel funds traditionally have taken equity stakes in businesses, and they're trying to finance the growth and kind of expansion of the operation. But what I'm also seeing is some of these angel funds are out there with debt instruments. So they're looking at debt instruments that are a function of revenues, and revenues are a function of cash flows. So the way that they get their return is they take a percentage of either the revenues or of the maybe gross profits, and that's how they're actually getting returns to their investors. So there's a little bit more innovation in the marketplace that is emerging as a result of this crisis. So I think it's important, if a business sees an opportunity in the marketplace, that they kind of reach out to investment bankers or private equity individual or angel investors, and get an idea of what's the cost of capital, what's the source of capital, what are the requirements of the capital, and looking at that maybe as a funding resource that they can use to continue to grow and expand their business. Because there will be, as we've talked about, a number of fatalities related to this crisis.
Mhm.
I just saw a thing recently that up to a third of restaurants may not reopen. And it's amazing what's going to happen. So you look at that across the board, what's going to happen with maybe all kinds of different industries, whether or not be commercial real estate, or what's going to be even residential real estate, or what's going to happen to our manufacturing companies, or what's, when we kind of repatriate some of our manufacturing is going to be coming from China. So our economy, I think, is going to go through a significant kind of evolution or maybe revolution as it relates to some of the manufacturing capacity and the way businesses are financed.
So we're coming up. We've got about I've got one question left, and it says, "Will we ever pull out of the federal debt we've created from these huge relief acts? The canyon is so deep."
Good luck.
I'm not quite sure what to say. It's like, yeah, this is a little bit of a problem. But Dawn, I don't know if you want to take that one on.
Well, I can. I'm just going to reiterate what I watch and what I hear on TV and what I read. So this is not coming from me. This is just basically, this is Treasury, or this is the Federal Reserve Powell. This is Mnuchin talking. So one thing that we thought was interesting, and it was discussed, okay, let's talk about kind of the breakdown of the stimulus. So from the federal government in pure fiscal policy, not monetary policy, but fiscal policy, the programs have injected, it's estimated right in the neighborhood of $4 trillion. Secondly, the Federal Reserve, because of their easing of their monetary policy in basically printing additional money, have injected probably upwards between 6 to 8 trillion. So it's estimated there's almost like $13 trillion of additional capital that's been injected into this economy. Even the US government right now is talking about issuing, which still staggers the mind, 50 to 100-year bonds. So
wow.
Those in the incremental rates for a 50 to 100-year bond. I mean, can you imagine selling this internationally to China or some other foreign investor, and they don't get paid for 100 years, and they're going to buy off on an interest rate that is probably 100 basis points, 1% rate of return, or maybe 125 basis points. So the point being is that because the way the U.S. government, actually one thing I'll throw in, the U.S. government and I think the Fed has agreed to do this, is a 20-year bond. And those rates are in about 140 basis points or so in that neighborhood. So we're able to fund the stimulus programs with very low cost, long-term money. So the way that the federal government believes that they can work their way out of this mess is through inflation and growth. So you need both, because that makes the purchasing power related to the repayment of those bonds that much more better. So if we have a higher economy, a larger economy, because our GDP right now is probably about, I think, $16 trillion, $17 trillion. Our federal deficit's about $23 trillion. So it's estimated that the way that we were able to repay this is just extending the loan terms at these very low interest rates. Because even when you look at Europe and you look at other parts of the world, they have negative interest rates. I mean, Germany, I think, is like negative 50 basis points. So they charge you 0.5% to hold your money. And that's why they're financing some of their deficits, because they're sitting in this kind of unusual environment with extremely low interest rates. So the key for us, the federal government, to work their way through this is that we're going to grow the economy. We're going to grow federal revenues. But unfortunately, we have get off this topic because it's amazing. But we're finding ourselves in what we call the crowding out effect. So the crowding out effect is mean that interest continues. The interest expense component of our budget right now is about 1/3. So as we continue to take on more federal debt, that interest component expense will continue to crowd out other kind of discretionary and non-discretionary programs. So there's going to be an impact that the US government is going to have to figure out in terms of how we ultimately finance all this debt, because it's anticipated that with all the additional potential, another stimulus program that's passed through the House recently, that's another $3 trillion. So we're adding $3 trillion plus the $4 trillion that's already been pretty much injected. The unfortunate part of the roughly 4 trillion that's been passed, it's estimated that less than half of that has actually been dispersed.
Yep.
So we haven't seen yet the results of what the stimulus programs have done on the economy and helping small businesses to pay their debts and to bolster unemployment expenses, et cetera. So we haven't seen the total effect. So some of our leaders are talking about deferring this next stimulus program until we see the full effect of the existing stimulus program. So there's a lot going on there.
So Julie, my short answer is we haven't figured it out in the recent past, and we probably will take some time to figure it out in the future,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. Well, we're coming up that it is 13:28 for those of you who are in military time, and which I am. So I wanted to say thank you to Perkins & Company for hosting this. And Dawn, it was great to hear your perspective on things. And Scott, I appreciate your input as well. You've got the contact information up on the screen for each of us. And next week, we will be reconvening at 12:30 on Wednesday, and we'll be covering ways to leverage new opportunities as we start to emerge out of this pandemic. And I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us.
Well, thank you all. Thank you
Thank
to
you.
the attendees for attending, and thank you to the Perkins marketing team for assisting us through this process.
Very good.
All right, thank you.
Okay, till next week. Take care. Thank you.